You could.
So I'm Freeman Dyson, Freeman Dyson, retired professor of physics at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton.
Terrific. Why don't we start with your experience in World War II, and maybe you could tell us what your role was.
So in World War II, I was given the job of operations research, which is really just a polite way of saying statistician, collecting information about the operations of the British Bomber Command. At that time, this was 1943, so the war was 2/3 over. So I came in only for the last 2 years. We had a huge bombing campaign operating against Germany. In fact, the day I arrived at Bomber Command was just the day after the first heavy attack on Hamburg, which was a turning point of the bombing campaign. It was the first time we really destroyed a city. So we had it was a jubilant air in the place when the day I arrived, and I was immediately given the job of calculating the position of the bomber force at various times of the night and plotting the places where bombers were shot down. And so that was my trade, just investigating the progress of operations on a very short time scale. So they wanted to have the information within a couple of days. And so that was what I did essentially for the rest of the war, just collecting information about the operations. And I was concerned with the bomber losses. The operational research section to which I belonged, which was a bunch of civilian scientists. We were divided into two main groups. There was the bomber effectiveness group and there was the bomber losses group. So I was in the bomber losses group, so I wasn't so much concerned with what the bombing was doing, but how many bombers we lost.
This is an aside, but I did read something about, maybe it was in one of your works, about how they figured out how to substantially reduce the number of bomber losses through some device.
Window.
Yes, maybe.
That it happened also that the day I arrived at Bomber Command was also the day after we first used Window. Window was a device for jamming the German radars. It simply consisted of strips of paper with aluminum on one side, so they conducted electricity. And each strip was of the right length just to resonate with one of the German radars. And so there were two main German radar systems, which we called Freya and Würzburg. And they were, these strips of paper were tuned to jam them both. And so one of my jobs the very first week was calculating the distribution of these paper strips, where they actually were in the sky at various times, and figuring out how effective they would be as jammers. Well, it turned out that they were highly effective for 1 week, and that was it. And after that, they had no effect at all. So this was sort of typical of the way real life works, that you have some very clever idea which everybody thinks is going to win the war. And it turns out that it works beautifully, but then the Germans are also rather clever. And so they think of a countermeasure, and within 1 week the whole thing is nullified. So that was what happened. That for that week, while we were attacking Hamburg, the window we calculated saved about 100 bombers. The losses went down abruptly. We would have lost maybe 300, and we actually lost 200 during that week or something like that. It was a very noticeable reduction in losses. In the first night, we only lost 12, which was far below. The normal loss rate at that time was about 5%. And so we were flying 500 or 600 bombers, which meant we were losing maybe 25 or 30 each operation, and so we only lost 12 that first night. So that was a triumph. Certainly Window worked just that first night. But what the Germans did was, with a speed which we found miraculous. I mean, we expected the Germans would finally be able to counter a window, but we never expected they would react so fast. They must have been well prepared for this. The Germans must have had all their plans ready. I mean, they knew this was coming. And so it only took them a week, actually, to get a completely new organization for the fighter defense. Most of the bombers were shot down by night fighters. And the German night fighters were very good. So before window, each fighter was actually controlled from the ground by a radar, or rather by two radars, so that they had one radar focused on the bomber and one focused on the fighter. So from the ground, they would vector the fighter to intercept the bomber, so they'd shoot them down one at a time. Well, after window, they abandoned that system completely because the window made it ineffective. And instead, the ground controller simply vectored the fighters into the general neighborhood of the bomber stream, and the German fighters carried airborne radar, and so they were able to do the homing onto the individual bombers. And at short range, the window didn't work, because as soon as you got within a few miles of the bomber, you could see it anyway. And so that the fighters then, within a very short time, were just as effective as they had been before. That's the sort of typical of the way things work in wars.
So people think that if you have a technological edge, that you can, vanquish the enemy. But obviously, you have to keep your technological edge sharp.
And it's the same with civil defense, that the Germans were being heavily bombed for about 3 years. And so they got very good at civil defense. And whereas in Britain, we were only bombed for 6 months, and we never really got the hang of it. So it was a huge difference that it actually took 10 times as many bombs to kill one person in Germany as it did to kill one person in London. And that was, of course, one of the reasons why the campaign failed, that the German civil defense was just very good. And so you can actually save people with civil defense. Most people are unaware of that, but civil defense does work. And it would also work against nuclear bombs. And of course, that's a politically unpopular view, but it happens to be true.
Can you explain that?
Well, because most of the people who are killed in nuclear bombing, in fact, are killed by blast and fire, which is sort of old-fashioned. It's nothing to do with nuclear radiation. Some people die of nuclear radiation, but that's a small number by comparison. And if you're 5 feet underground, you're very well shielded from all of that. And so most people, even in a nuclear bombing, would survive if they're 5 feet underground. Of course, in Hiroshima, they didn't have that. But if they had time, if the Japanese had had a couple of years, they would have learned, and probably faster than that. So it's quite unrealistic to imagine that with good civil defense, that Hiroshima would have been so devastating.
Oh, that's interesting. Your experience with the Air Force, you wrote in Disturbing the Universe that the experience led you to conclude that, quote, bombing of cities was a pointless waste of lives.
Right, on both sides. And I mean, we lost a tremendous number of airmen, something like 40,000. These young men were killed. And the Germans lost 400,000 civilians. And it made no difference to the war, practically speaking. I mean, the real war was being fought on the ground, and mostly in Russia. But I should mention, just in connection with the civil defense, there was a wonderful book which was written after the war by a man called Hans Rumpf. The title was Der Hochrote Hahn, which means that the scarlet rooster, which means fire. And this fellow was actually head of the German civil defense. And he described how they operated. It's a splendid book. Of course, nobody ever reads it.
That's great.
I don't think it was ever translated, as far as I know.
Maybe you could pick up on what you just said, but talk about how the decision Britain made the decision in 1936 to start a campaign for the building big bombers and thinking that this war would be fought with the Air Force and less of the ground. I don't know, or whatever.
Yeah, well, let me start from World War I, which is really what was dominating everybody's thinking at that time. The people who were running the various governments in different countries leading up to World War II, they'd all lived through World War I, and they were totally dominated by their memories of World War I, whatever it was. And on the British side, of course, World War I was just an unspeakable tragedy, and I mean, our lives were dominated by this feeling of tragedy that this war had been so horrible and killed so many people and had destroyed European civilization in a sense, and had just led to a general feeling of doom and gloom everywhere. And so the number one imperative in everybody's mind was, we won't fight World War I over again. I mean, that was just absolutely the dominating principle. So how do you do it then? I mean, the question was, now Hitler comes along. We're faced with Hitler. We'll have to fight him one way or another. He was hell-bent on conquering Europe, and he more or less said so publicly. So we were faced with this problem. Well, in Britain, the chief advocate of bombing was Sir Hugh Trenchard, who had been the chief of the Royal Flying Corps in World War I. In World War I, the Royal Flying Corps was part of the army, so it operated just as a tactical air force. And Hugh Trenchard was the boss. And he sort of flew over the trenches. The people down in the trenches were dying in millions, and he was flying overhead. And he just said, that's not the right way to do it. Well, instead of fighting in trenches, we should be attacking the Germans directly. And so he set himself already in 1917, when the World War I was raging, that next time we'll do it differently. So he became then head of the Royal Air Force when it was established, when it became an independent command. And he was still very influential in the 1930s. And he campaigned then for having a big air force, and he won. So that the strategic plan was actually officially adopted in 1936, that World War II should be an air war, not a ground war. And so the big money was put into Bomber Command. Bomber Command, in fact, was, I think, 1/4 of the entire British economy or something. It was very, very large. So that already in 1936, we started building factories to build big bombers. And so we had the production lines running, and big bombers were being produced by the time the war started. And of course, in the Battle of Britain, of course, these were an encumbrance. And what we needed was fighters, not bombers. But still, I mean, we barely just had enough fighters to squeeze by. And then for the rest of the war, we continued producing bombers. And so the question was, what do you do with them? And originally, of course, the idea was, oh, you use these bombers for attacking military targets, and you just bomb factories and bomb war communications, trains and bridges and things of this sort, tactical military objectives. But they quickly discovered, first of all, that you couldn't fly over Germany in the daytime because you got shot down. And if you went at night, you couldn't hit anything smaller than a city. And so the answer was then, that was decided quite early in the war, that it had to be a night bombing campaign, because that was the only hope of surviving. And it had to be a campaign against cities, not against factories. And So that was how it went. It was sort of the logic of war sort of dictated how it should be fought. Once you decided that your main weapon was to be strategic bombers, then that was all you could do. And so that's how the whole thing started. Well, in America, the situation was somewhat similar. There was, again, a decision to have an independent Air Force and to make it heavy. But of course, the Americans still believed in daylight bombing, which it turned out they couldn't do. So actually, they very sensibly made the decision in 1943 not to go over Germany at all. So they were not bombing Germany during the greater part of the war, because they only had daylight bombers, and they got shot down. So they made the wise decision, let's not do that. And so during this sort of the middle two years of the war, the British Air Force was bombing more or less alone, and the Americans were waiting till they had long-range fighters to escort the bombers, which in the end they did. So it was a complicated story, but I mean both America and Britain decided strategic bombing was a good idea, which of course Hitler never did. Hitler never believed in strategic bombing. He was always a ground soldier, and he believed in fighting the war on the ground. And the Americans finally then built the B-29 force to bomb Japan, which was essentially on the British model, was for night bombing. And the B-29s were built essentially as city destroyers. That was, I don't know when that decision was made, probably quite early in the war. They decided they had to go for Japan, and Japan was always postponed until after Germany had been defeated. But in fact, they made the decision to build these bombers long before, of course. And the B-29s were very effective in Japan. Everything worked well in Japan because they had no time. The Japanese bombing started in March 1945 with a huge attack on Tokyo, which killed more people than any other attack in the war on either German or Japanese. I think they killed 150,000 people in one night, destroyed about half of Tokyo. So that was the sort of the opening salvo, and then the bombing continued for 3 months, and essentially all the cities in Japan were destroyed. And the Japanese never had time to get organized in the way the Germans did.
Would you like to take a sip of water?
Yeah, that's a good idea.
Yeah. All right, tape is good.
So we're rolling.
I don't know. I'm personally interested in the civil defense in London and why it wasn't greater.
Yeah, well, in London, of course, we had shelters. I mean, the tube system was wonderful. We had every tube station was filled with bunk beds, so people could go down and spend the night there if they wanted. But we were not compelled to go. There was no, and of course the Germans were. That was the difference. And in Britain it was voluntary. You could go down if you felt like it, and most people didn't, of course. And we weren't being bombed heavily enough so that everybody went down. So in fact, rather few people went down. It was a social meeting place down there, and lots of people went down just because it was fun, even when they weren't being bombed. But it wasn't used the way it should have been. And anyway, I mean, I was in London only a few nights during the bombing, and so we never thought of going down to the shelters. That wasn't the question never came up. It was much more interesting to be up and look out of the window and see what was going on.
It's very interesting. I mean, there are many stories of Churchill, how he felt it was exhilarating to be shot at. And
Oh yes, it was true, of course. I mean, I was a teenager at that point, and it was fun. There was a wonderful film made many years later called Hope and Glory. I don't know if you've ever seen that. But it was an excellent film, the best film about the British war experience that I know. It was the war seen through the eyes of a 10-year-old. And of course, it was a great lark, and that's actually very accurate. And
it's great. You talked about in your book about how the scientists at Los Alamos, in fact, had a great lark.
yes, that was very true. I mean, everyone you'd speak to who was at Los Alamos during those years always say, oh, it was a wonderful time. It was the high point of their lives as scientists. And it was a time when everybody was in it together, not working for personal credit, but working for a clearly defined goal, and with all these great people working together. It was something that they'd never experienced either before or since.
Another thing you talk about, which I think is interesting, Oppenheimer confessed famously, in some sort of crude sense, the physicists have known sin. But they did not, you commented, they did not just build the bomb, they enjoyed building it. They had the best time of their lives while building it. And that the Americans lacked the tragic sense of life, which was deeply ingrained in Europeans.
That's true, of course, yes. That
you have to remember, people aren't necessarily going to hear my question.
yes.
So,
No, well, it certainly was true that when Oppenheimer said that the physicists had known sin, many people, of course, violently objected to that. They'd said, oh, we were just soldiers working for the war like other soldiers, and there was not. If it's sinful to fight wars at all, then we were sinners, but otherwise not. And they had a good point. I mean, they at that point, certainly everybody was involved in the war essentially in the same way. We were fighting what we considered for a good cause. But the difference was that the soldiers were really suffering, whereas the scientists at Los Alamos were not. And so I think what Oppenheimer probably had in mind was the fact that they actually enjoyed doing what they were doing. It wasn't just that they were soldiers fighting in a good cause, but they were also having a great time and having the best time of their lives. And that was, in some sense, sinful. And I think that he was right.
do you think? I mean, you mentioned in that section of the book that it was Richard Feynman was sort of an exception because he had lost his wife to TB, and he had a more, sort of, I don't know, would you say tragic, but he had certainly experienced tragedy.
Well, it was worse than that. He hadn't yet lost her. He was losing her all during those years. She was dying, but not yet dead. No, that was very true. I mean, he really understood what it was to suffer, and Americans, generally speaking, didn't. I mean, I felt the contrast very strong when I came to America, I came to America in 1947, which was 2 years later, but of course Feynman was still living under the shadow of this tragedy. And so I got to know Feynman then. It was great luck. When I came to America, I'd never heard of Feynman, and within a couple of weeks I was his friend, and it was purely by accident.
Let's see. Well, let's talk about that. Talk about your coming to America and why you came and where you went and who you worked with.
Yeah, well, after the war, I actually wanted to go to Russia. My plan was to go and study in Russia. I loved the language, and I had been also aware of the fact that there were some very fine scientists in Russia, in particular people like Tamm and Landau and Kapitsa and such. So Russia had a really high level of excellence in science, in spite of the Communist Party. But the Communist Party had attacked biology very seriously, but they'd never attacked physics. So physics was going strong. And so I wanted to go to Russia. Well, then, after the war, things rapidly deteriorated. They became less and less feasible to go as a student to Russia. And but within about 6 months, it was fairly clear that it was impossible, that it wasn't going to work. They didn't welcome foreigners anymore. So America was the second choice, which was, of course, very fortunate, as it turned out. And so I made plans to come to America. Everybody in England wanted to travel because we'd been cooped up in the island for 6 years. And the easiest way to travel at that point was to go to America because America had money. And so there was a wonderful institution called the Commonwealth Fund, which gave away money to students to come to America. So I applied for a Commonwealth Fellowship and got it. And then the question was where to go. And I happened to meet Sir Hugh Taylor, who was one of the British scientists who had been at Los Alamos. So I met him in Cambridge and said, where should I go in America? And he said, Cornell. And that the conversation was over in about 5 seconds. And he said, Cornell is where all the bright people went after the war was over. And he knew. And of course, I had never heard of Cornell, but I thought, well, I'll take his advice. And so I applied. And there I went. And so I came to Cornell to work with Hans Bethe, who is, of course, one of the greatest physicists in the world. And he was right there at Cornell. He had been second in command at Los Alamos. So it was just an ideal situation. And then, in addition to Hans Bethe, there were many others of the Los Alamos veterans who were then only about 30 years old. Feynman and Phil Morrison and Bob Wilson. Well, Bob Wilson was chief of experimental physics. Bethe was chief of theoretical physics. And Phil Morrison was actually the fellow who carried the plutonium core to Tinian for the Nagasaki attack. And so he was deeply involved in the business. And Phil Morrison also visited Hiroshima very soon after it was destroyed. So there were those three people who were leading lights who had been deeply involved in Los Alamos. And so I learned everything right from the horse's mouth.
How did these scientists feel about their contribution to the war?
So all three of them, I think, were quite proud of what they had done. I think that they thought they had made a really important contribution to an important historical event, and they were proud of it. But they all had reservations, of course, particularly Wilson. I mean, he was. I think all three of them were convinced that the evils that could come out of this were much greater than whatever goods had been achieved, and so they were all of them campaigning for international control of weapons. It was. They were all heavily engaged politically. And they'd set up the Federation of American Scientists, which is still going strong now after 60 years. And the Federation was actually working very hard to get the bombs under control before the Russians would start a major arms race. And there were two proposals which were presented, because the United Nations then was new. Everybody had high hopes the United Nations could actually deal with this problem. So they held meetings at the United Nations, And there were two proposals. There was an American proposal for a very elaborate international control system, which was essentially giving all nuclear processes away to an international authority. So there should be no national nuclear programs, but only an international program, and no weapons at all. And so that was a very, very ambitious proposal, which was actually largely put together by Oppenheimer. I mean, Oppenheimer thought that was the way to do it, and he had high friends in the government at very high levels. And so that was adopted as the official American proposal. And it's called the Baruch Plan because Bernard Baruch was the one who actually presented it at the United Nations. Well, in opposition to that, there was the Soviet proposal, which was much simpler and I think much better. And what the Russians said was, let's just make bombs illegal, and that's it. And treat it the same way chemical weapons were treated after World War I. I mean, after World War I, you had the Geneva Convention, which most countries signed, not the United States, but almost everybody else signed. So chemical weapons were declared illegal, which meant that there was no international authority building chemicals or anything of that kind. It was simply a legal prohibition. And so if anybody was producing chemical weapons, that was contrary to international law, and the people involved could be condemned as criminals, but there was no enforcement. And so that was essentially the Soviet proposal, that you do the same thing with nuclear weapons. So every country was free to build reactors and to build peaceful nuclear power plants, and that was all left in the hands of nations. But you simply had a legal prohibition against producing bombs. And I think that would have worked the same way it did with chemical weapons. I mean, it's a remarkable achievement that chemical weapons were not used in World War II. And that was essentially a consequence of the Geneva Convention. The soldiers just disliked chemical weapons. They had had enough of that in World War I. It was a horrible way of fighting, and no self-respecting soldier wanted to do that. And I think one could have done that with nuclear weapons too. Anyway, that was the Soviet proposal. And of course, nobody took it seriously in this country. Just the fact that it was a Soviet proposal meant that it was political death even to support it. That if you support it meant you were a commie, and so it never got a hearing really at all. It is a great shame. And so none of my friends actually took the Soviet proposal seriously. And certainly, I mean, Oppenheimer was of course fighting for the American proposal very strongly, and everybody else went along. The Bethe and Morrison and Wilson, I think, all firmly believed in this international control system as being the key. And I think it wasn't really practical. And anyway, it was clear the Russians weren't going to go along with it. The Russians obviously completely determined to have their own program. And Stalin had already decided that. And nothing we could do would change it. So I think the American proposal was probably dead on arrival, really. But anyhow, so the negotiations never got anywhere. So anyway, I mean, 60 years later, I think we might have learned something. And I still think the Soviet proposal would make sense today.
This is a good pause for you, but that was very nice. But do you want to pick up there? I want to make sure we circle back to, the dropping the bomb and so forth, but we
Yes.
could launch off in
No, let's do the
today's-
bomb.
Shall we do that? Finish
Yes.
that, okay. So if we go back to before the war ended and the decision that Stimson and Truman had to go forward with dropping the bomb on the Japanese. You talked earlier about the bombing campaign. Tokyo with, and I guess 32 other cities with conventional bombing, and then the decision to use the atomic bomb. Do you think that Truman made the right decision?
So there are two totally different questions here, which I think are very much confused in the public mind, but it's very important to keep them separate. I mean, the first question is, what actually happened in Japan? Why did the Japanese surrender? And did it have anything to do with the nuclear bombs? That's one question. And I think it's a very important question, but it should be kept separate from the second question, which is, what did it look like to Truman? How much information did Truman actually have about what was going on in Japan? And when he made the decision to drop the bombs, was that justifiable or not? And that's a totally separate question, because Truman had actually very little information. And so his decision wasn't at all governed by what was really happening in Japan. His decision was governed by what he knew, and which is a very different thing. So I think that it's very important to keep those two things separate. So if you look at it from the Japanese point of view, that their whole strategy at the late stages of the war was to make a reasonably advantageous peace. I mean, that they knew they couldn't win. By 1945, they were never going to conquer the United States, but they might make a peace treaty which left them some of their possessions, and which left them what they can, in a situation from their point of view, was politically acceptable. And their strategy was very largely based on Russia. And you hear that all the time when you look at the Japanese discussions, which now are available. There's a book recently been written by a historian called Hasegawa, which goes into this very carefully. And it's clear that the Japanese strategy was to end the war on more or less advantageous terms with the help of Russia. And it was very important that the Russians were neutral and that they could have some real influence on the United States, since the war in Europe was still going on, and it was important for the United States to keep the alliance with Russia. Russia was then in alliance with the United States. And that alliance was extremely important as long as the war in Europe continued. So the whole Japanese strategy was to use the Russians to negotiate peace with America, and in the meantime just to fight a defensive war as long as they could. And the Japanese army, of course, was committed to defense to the very last man, as they had done in Okinawa. So everybody knew that the Japanese would fight to the last man. That was sort of taken for granted. And anyway, that whole strategy collapsed when the Russians declared war on Japan. And that happened, I forget the exact dates, but it was, I think, August 12th or something like that. It was 3 days after Hiroshima anyway. So the sequence of events was first Hiroshima, and 3 days later the Russian declaration of war, and then the same afternoon the attack on Nagasaki. So those three events. And when you look at it carefully, it turns out that the supreme war-making authority in Japan was what it was called the Supreme Council or something of that kind. And it was a bunch of about 10 people, mostly military people, but including the emperor. And when Hiroshima was bombed, the Secretary of the Navy, I think, said, let's have a meeting of the Supreme Council. And everybody else said, no, we're busy, we don't want to do that. They didn't take Hiroshima that seriously. And so the evidence is quite clear that Hiroshima didn't have much effect. And 3 days later, the Russians declared war. There was a meeting of the Supreme Council within 6 hours. And it was clear that that was really important to everybody. It knocked the bottom out of the whole strategy. And they knew, first of all, that after the Russians declared war, that they would be unable to have any help from Russia in making peace. Also, they were in grave danger of being overrun by the Russians. The Russians were already invading Manchuria, and they didn't have the troops to fight for Americans in the south and the Russians in the north at the same time. That the whole strategy, in fact, collapsed on that morning. And so that was the day that they actually decided to surrender. And it was quite clearly in response to the Russian invasion and not to the bombing. Also, Nagasaki actually happened the same day, but it was too late to influence the decision. So I think the evidence is clear that the Japanese surrender was in fact caused by the Russian invasion and not by the bombs. At least 90% to 10% or something like that. So that's that question. But then the other question, what about Truman? If you look at it from Truman's point of view, he knew that the certain part of the Japanese government was trying to make peace. He also knew that the large part of the Japanese government was determined not to make peace, particularly the army. And the army considered it totally dishonorable to surrender under any circumstances. You just fought to the last man, and that was it. And from their point of view, this whole thing, this question of surrender should never arise. And so that was a very serious consideration for Truman, that the army was likely to go on fighting no matter what. And it was quite clear that if you had to invade Japan and fight the Japanese street by street through the city of Tokyo, it was going to be enormously costly. And Okinawa showed how tough the Japanese were. And in their own country, they'd probably be even tougher. So I think it was very reasonable to say, if you had to invade Japan and fight over every mile of ground, it would cost probably 1 million American soldiers or something like that. I mean, it would have been a huge undertaking. And so Truman certainly looked at it from that point of view, that it was a sort of a choice between dropping the bombs, hoping it would have a shock value, cause a quick surrender, or invading Japan and having huge losses. And that was more or less the way the decision was presented to him. And I think there's absolutely no doubt if that was the choice, the sensible thing to do was to drop the bombs. And I think that's the way he looked at it. And I think he was right. I mean, judging by all the information he had, that the Japanese attempts to surrender were not that clear at all. I mean, it was clear there was a faction in the Japanese Foreign Office which wanted to negotiate. But it was equally clear that the war was still going on and the army wasn't interested in surrendering it. So it was essentially, he was, I think, completely justified in what he did. It's also questionable whether he could have made any other decision, because, I mean, there's this bureaucratic inertia which is tremendous, that the whole bombing campaign against Japan had been running for 3 months and with huge destruction of Japanese cities. And, well, why not do a little bit more if it's going to end the war? I mean, the inertia was just tremendous. And suddenly to say, let's stop, we've got this beautiful new bomb, but we're not going to use it. That would have been politically very, very hard to do. And I think Truman might, in fact, have been impeached if he failed to drop the bombs when he had them ready. I mean, it would have produced a very violent reaction if he had said no. And I can imagine that, I mean, the power of a president is always conditional on having sort of the passive consent of everybody involved. And if the majority of the military were against him, he probably might not have been able to get them to do what he said. And it's I think it's anyway, to my mind, I think, so the answers to the two questions are in contradiction to each other. I mean, on the one hand, the bombs in fact didn't cause the Japanese surrender. But on the other hand, Truman believed it would. And so he was justified in dropping the bombs. I mean, it's an ironical conclusion, but I think it's more or less right.
Oh, that was wonderful. I wonder if you mentioned the Hasegawa book, and that's only come out within the last year or two.
Yes.
When you look back for this issue has been so controversial.
Yes.
For those, how do we enlighten people? I mean, it is up until the book came out. Did you feel the same way? I mean,
No.
Yeah.
No, in fact, I changed my mind about a year ago as a result of talking to a young man called Ward Wilson, who lives here in Princeton. He's not famous. He's written about this subject, and I think in a very convincing way. So it was he who brought Hasegawa to my attention. And what he points out is that there's an enormously strong piece of evidence which has not been, even Hasegawa didn't make a big deal of this, but I think it is, to my mind, it's the most interesting of all. That was the official order which the emperor wrote ordering the army to surrender. And he makes the argument why they should surrender. And it's his own words, and I think it sounds very genuine, that he doesn't mention the bombs at all. In that order to the army, he refers to the events of 1895. So he has very much of a historical view. That in 1895, there was a war between Japan and China, and the Japanese won. So China was in bad shape at that time, of course. And anyway, the Japanese then occupied Manchuria and were defeating China. And at that point, the European powers intervened, in particular Russia. And the Russians said to Japanese, "You've no business here." And they actually took over Manchuria, drove the Japanese out. And the Japanese surrendered to the Europeans. Essentially, they accepted the European ultimatum. And with the emperor, what was his name? The great emperor who modernized Japan.
Sun Yat-sen?
What? No, it's stupid. I don't remember his name. But anyway, I mean, Meiji, M-E-I-J-I, is Meiji. Meiji was the emperor then, and he had tremendous prestige. He had modernized Japan, and he said, we should surrender to keep the Russians out of Japan. We don't want the Russians interfering in our lives. So give them Manchuria, which is what he did. So that then, of course, 10 years later, Japan could get its revenge. And 10 years later, in 1905, they whipped the Russians. But they needed that 10 years to recover their strength. And so anyway, Meiji ordered this surrender as a tactical move, essentially. And it worked. And so that's what the emperor in 1945 recalled. He said, the great Emperor Meiji surrendered, we should do the same thing. It's the best moment. We get better conditions now than we will later. So let's surrender quickly and get it over with and preserve whatever we can. And that's what the order says. And it explicitly points to Russia as the reason for surrendering and says nothing about the bombs. And I think, he was talking to his own people when he wrote that. And I think that's the way he was thinking. But anyway, it looks to me very plausible anyway. Because we'll never know 100%, but because they never really explained themselves afterwards. And afterwards, the Japanese propagated the myth that the bombs had been decisive, because it was much more honorable to surrender to a sort of new force of nature than to surrender to the Russians. And that was said by there's another document which is in Hasegawa's book. So I think it was written by the Secretary of the Navy, saying that we should tell everybody we surrendered because of the bombs. Anyhow, that's the evidence, and I think it's pretty strong.
I'm trying to think how this affects Americans today in thinking about the war and the whole issue of should we or shouldn't we have. I guess that new evidence, of course, I think you point out it's two questions.
Yes.
Because you have to go back to the context of the time. It's certainly not fair to impose the knowledge we have in 2008 to Truman,
right,
when he did not know these things, and this is what he had to base his decision on.
Yes.
Not these other things.
Yes, I agree. And no, I think it's very important to keep those two things separate. Right. That in fact, the bombs didn't end the war, but we thought they did. And that's the truth. And so anyway, I draw strong conclusions from all this, that we could get rid of nuclear weapons now, essentially by following the Russian plan, declaring nuclear weapons to be illegal. And we just get rid of ours. That's what George Bush Sr. did with the tactical nuclear weapons. I think in 1991, I think it was. Anyway, when Gorbachev was still in charge in the Soviet Union, just before the Soviet Union disappeared. So when it was clear that relations between America and Russia were finally getting friendly, and what George Bush Sr. did was simply unilaterally say, we're not going to have tactical nuclear weapons at all. And those were these little nukes, each of which is big enough to destroy a city. But they were deployed all around the world in the most dangerous places. And of course we had lots of them in England, we had lots of them in Germany, we had lots of them in Japan, and all over the place, and also in Korea, and where it was, and on ships, which was perhaps the most dangerous of all. I actually made a visit to the United States ship Princeton. It was an armed missile cruiser carrying 100 long-range missiles on this cruiser. These were tactical missiles. Half of them were nukes and half of them were non-nukes, and they were on the same ship. It was completely crazy. Just press the wrong button and you fired a nuke instead of a old-fashioned or conventional missile. And those things were just a war waiting to start by accident. And anyhow, so those were got rid of. Now the Princeton still carries missiles, but it doesn't carry nuclear missiles. So the surface navy became completely non-nuclear. The army became completely non-nuclear. All that's left is the Air Force and the submarines. And so that was a huge act of unilateral disarmament done by George Bush Sr., and he did it one afternoon, carefully timing it so it coincided with the settlement of the tobacco lawsuit, which got all the headlines. So nothing of this appeared in the newspapers, but it just happened, just very quietly. Nobody raised any objections. And then a few days later, Gorbachev said, well, that makes sense, we'll do it too. So the Russians got rid of theirs also. And that's the way it should be, I think. And we could do it again with the strategic weapons. Probably would work just as well. I mean, you don't get rid of all of them in one day, but you get rid of a lot. And by making them illegal, it gives you a very much stronger grounds for resisting proliferation. That I mean, you're not going to get rid of the danger of hidden weapons. The danger of hidden weapons will always be there, just as it is now. And so you won't be able to inspect all these various countries that you think might be hiding nuclear weapons. But if they're illegal, it means that it has to be on a fairly small scale and comparatively, and it's and you have then a legal justification for taking very strong measures if you find out they've been cheating, and that's I think the best you can do. It's certainly much better than the present situation. Present situation, the Russians and the United States both have these huge arsenals of strategic nukes, and those, I think, they're far more dangerous than anything that Iran or the North Koreans may produce. And so we can get rid of those anyway.
Well, how do you respond to those who believe that we really can't afford to be caught without, a deterrent or, some effective means to stand up to North Korea or Iran, or that's poised to use their illegal weapon back at us?
Well, it's of course there's no perfect solution to the problem. I mean, everything you do has risks, and that's one of the risks. That's all. But in fact, it's overwhelmingly probable that if the United States gets attacked with a nuclear weapon, that it won't be from a government at all, but it will be a bunch of bad guys carrying in the weapon in a suitcase or in a car or in a truck or something of that kind, and you won't even know where it comes from. And that's, I think, by far the most probable danger to the United States. And that danger you don't deal with by deterrence at all. It's so for that point of view, it's sort of irrelevant how much we have ourselves. And it's also possible one of our own weapons gets stolen and used against us, so that's another reason for not having them. And the other possibility, which is quite probable, if the North Koreans are serious, or if the Iranians are serious, they'll be using them against their neighbors, not against us. And that's also certainly a real possibility. And it's again a question, what do you want to do? If for example, the Iranians built a bomb and used it to destroy Tel Aviv, which is, I suppose, the most likely target, what do we do? Do we destroy Iran? I don't think so. I mean, it's a question, but it's hard to imagine that we would really do that. It wouldn't. I mean, I don't see any moral justification for it. But It could happen, of course. But whatever happens, I mean, the world is unpredictable. But I feel we're fundamentally in much greater danger in a world with 20,000 nuclear weapons than in a world with 20. I mean, it's an enormous difference. If there are 20,000 weapons in existence and things go badly, we can end up shooting them at the Russians and the Russians shooting theirs against us. If a war gets out of control, and we can end up destroying ourselves very, very thoroughly. Whereas if the world has only 20, half in the hands of Iran, and maybe the Israelis have a lot more than that anyway, but maybe 100 in the hands of the Israelis. It's still a lot safer than having 20,000.
What do you see as a possible role for the national laboratories?
It's a very difficult question, because what should the national laboratories actually do? And because they are themselves a very strong bureaucratic influence, and they're politically strong. And of course we have 3 national labs, Los Alamos, Livermore, and Sandia. We need at most one. And the problem is, how do you get rid of 2 of them, or even better, how do you get rid of 3 of them? It's difficult. I mean, and what we'd love to do, what most of us would love to do, I mean, most of us meaning the people who are sensible, people who think like me, is to give the national labs something totally different to do. And, for example, to study various forms of energy production, and to study the sort of the new world of reduced carbon emissions and things of this kind, which the national labs are well set up to do. It's still not clear we need 3, and so I don't know the answer. It's very, very hard to turn the bureaucracy around. You have all these very, very highly skilled people whose lives have been devoted to maintaining the stockpile, and they're very good at it, and they all feel it's absolutely essential that the coming generation should take over their places, and that this knowledge which they have so laboriously acquired should not be lost. And there's a lot of talk like that, and you can understand it. I know some of these old bomber designers, and they're wonderful people, and they command your respect, because they really know the stuff, and in a way I never will, and they believe what they've been doing makes sense. I mean, you've got to believe that. So it's hard to argue against them. I've tried sometimes and have not had much success. And Oak Ridge, I think, has done better, because it's not a weapons lab. It is, although they actually do make secondaries, but they're not seen as a weapons lab. And so Oak Ridge has become sort of a center for biological studies, not only concerning nuclear energy, but a lot of other things. They have a lot of biologists, and so they're the sort of world experts on effects of radiation originally, but also a lot of work which has nothing to do with nukes at all. So they have become, it's still, of course, it's half and half. It still has a large involvement with nuclear things, but it has a very large component which is not nuclear at all. So that's no doubt the way to go. Somehow just edge gradually out of the nuclear business.
Would there be at least one of the rationales for building the National Laboratory System back in the 40s was the expense of high-energy physics as a discipline, that these national laboratories would serve area universities, like Brookhaven would help NYU and Princeton and some of the that was the concept, and Chicago would, further that.
Argon.
And Argon, right? Argon, right? Would be alliance as they.
Yes,
had
and that works actually pretty well. Of course, I mean, Brookhaven, I think, has been very successful. It's suffering from lack of funding, but basically it's done a good job, and of course it has nothing to do with weapons. And so that certainly could be done if we would stop wasting all the money on weapons. We could spend it on science, and so that could be done. But it's hard to see that really as justifying 3 labs. It's the 3 weapons labs that are the problem. I mean, Oak Ridge could go back to building peaceful reactors, of course, also, which would be nice. There's a wonderful plan, which is, this is a digression, but I mean, this is the kind of thing the weapons labs might be doing, is building way far out kinds of reactors. There's a wonderful reactor design by Lowell Wood. Lowell Wood is one of these people who doesn't quite fit into the bureaucracy, but he's a friend of Edward Teller, and he's, I think, a very brilliant person. He's always inventing things. And so he has invented a nuclear power reactor which burns thorium, so it completely gets rid of the proliferation problem. You can build a power reactor which has no proliferation potential really at all. You build it deep underground, and it's helium cooled. And as long as you keep on pumping the helium, it continues to produce energy. If the helium stops, the thing stops. So you don't even have to switch it off. And it runs for 50 years without being refueled. So there's no refueling at all. You just start it out. It produces huge amounts of electricity, and it burns thorium, and after 50 years it's burned up, the thorium. You just leave it there. You never excavate it. So you don't have any problem with spent fuel. The fuel stays down below, and it's pretty harmless anyway. Whatever the spent fuel is, it's essentially just a limited amount of uranium-233, which could be used in principle to make bombs, but it's a small fraction, and it's very well protected with its own radioactivity. So that's, I think, a wonderful kind of a nuclear power. If you want to go into nuclear power, that's one of the ways to do it. And the National Lab could do a good job with that. It doesn't fit into the present commercial system. It's on the short run, it would be expensive, and no doubt there would be all sorts of technical problems. I mean, it needs a lot of work before it actually runs. And so that's the thing a national lab could do. And again, it has nothing to do with bombs.
My impression, I've spent a lot of time going back and forth to Los Alamos over the years, and my impression is that many of the scientists, at least 10 years ago, would make a bargain if they were young scientists. They really were hesitant, suppose, to throw their whole career into weapons, but they would be allowed to pursue a whole number of other avenues. That was part of the deal. They do
Yes.
some weapons work, but they could pursue nanotechnology or material science, or
Yes.
all these other fields. That
Yes, and of course they had a big biology program at Livermore, which actually was quite important.
Can you say something that we can use to help people understand how essential it is for the United States to invest in basic scientific research, even if there's no immediate product or payoff?
No, I always remember Bob Wilson, who was the head of experimental physics at Cornell, and then afterwards became head of these various big national accelerators. I mean, his whole life was building accelerators. And he built, I think, 4 accelerators in succession at Cornell, and then went on to build bigger and better ones like the Fermilab. And anyway, his technique in raising funds was very simple. He went to Congress and he said, this machine will never be economically profitable. It will never be useful for any practical purpose. It's just like building cathedrals. It's something that it's not to defend the country, but to make the country worth defending. And he got the money. And that was, I think, the right way to do it. I mean, he just said, this is something beautiful we should be doing. It costs a certain amount, but first of all, we'll never run over the budget. And secondly, we won't run over the time. And so every machine he built was always under budget, and it was always ready in time. And so the Congress liked him, and he always got the money he asked for. And I think that's the trick. I mean, you just none of this pretense about doing science because it's profitable or because it will help the country to compete. I mean, maybe that's true, but it's not the reason you do it. And I think that it's very important to be honest. Another gross violation of that principle, of course, was the International Space Station, which was sold to the public as having something to do with science, when in fact it has almost nothing to do with science. And as a result, I mean, the NASA became discredited. Everybody knows they were lying. And so when they ask for something now, which is real science, they don't get it. And so I think it's quite simple. So don't pretend that pure science is profitable. It usually isn't. And if it is, it's maybe 50 years later. But what you're doing when you do pure science is something different. It's exploring the universe. It's finding out what's there. And that's worth doing for its own sake, if it's worth doing at all.
Now, it may seem like I'm jumping around, but I want to catch some of these things. In our anthology, we have Churchill's memo to Roosevelt after they met at Hyde Park, and I think it was September of 1944.
Yes.
And they talked about the agreements, that they would continue sharing information about atomic energy
Right.
after the war. A very important thing that was not observed. And then they talked about, I think, the end of the war in Japan, and they might, if necessary, use the weapon on the atomic bomb on Japan. But also the third thing that Churchill mentions in this very short piece is how they need to keep an eye on Niels Bohr.
Yes. No, well, that was, of course, a part of history that I hadn't mentioned, that the whole idea of international control of nuclear weapons really originated with Niels Bohr. Niels Bohr was in a unique position because he was Danish, and he was essentially neutral, and still he was allowed to go to Los Alamos during the war and see what was going on. So he was the only person who wasn't officially cleared, but who actually knew what was happening. And so he was tolerated by the United States government. And I think that it was a remarkable piece of wisdom in a way that they let him in. And anyhow, so Niels Bohr was already in 1944 campaigning for international control of weapons. And he went and he actually got to see Churchill and he got to see Roosevelt. And he told both of them that you have to have international control if this thing is not to destroy the world. And neither of them listened, of course. They were, and Churchill in particular, considered that Niels Bohr was dangerous, that he was going to go to the Russians and tell them what was happening. And so he wanted to have him locked up. So that was a tragedy. But of course, Oppenheimer then talked a lot with Bohr during those times, He was right there at Los Alamos. And so Bohr and Oppenheimer were very close. And so Oppenheimer's campaign for international control was really just putting Bohr's ideas into practice. So, and then afterwards, Bohr openly, of course, campaigned for international control himself. And he wrote an open letter to the United Nations called The Open World, which is, I think, really a great piece of writing. It's so typical Bohr. He always took immense trouble with anything he wrote, so it comes out extremely complicated. But it's a beautiful piece, and so it's arguing that the essential thing to have for the survival of the world with nuclear weapons is openness, and that I think is still true. And and of course, making the weapons illegal is by far the best way of having openness. So if they're legal at all, then you have to have secrets which are officially protected, and that already gets you into trouble. And by having this illegal status for the weapons, you can then make it compulsory. I mean, according to international law, also to be open, and that you have to tell what you have. Anyway, that's roughly the way Bohr was arguing, and I don't think Bohr ever supported the Soviet proposal, but he came close, certainly closer than we did.
So he would have proposed to share all of the information.
Yes.
And
But
rely on some international controls then.
Yes, but so the secrets would have been held by the United Nations.
I see. There would still be the
There would be
design
lots of secrets, and,
Right,
and the
right,
United
right.
Nations would then license different countries to build reactors, but it would all be under United Nations control. It was I forget what it was called, a International Atomic Authority or something, which would actually have the power to do things.
So in looking at the 21st century, there's a whole new movement by, a civil discussion with George Shultz and Henry Kissinger and Sam Nunn and Gorbachev and others who were party to the events of the 80s when they were getting closer to, in early 90s, an agreement to end nuclear weapons. And this is, they've had some discussions in Stanford last fall, and the government of Norway invited, certain other nations to join in February.
Yes.
Where do you think these things might lead?
Well, I think they could go exactly to the direction I want, which, I'm enormously encouraged by this. Because, did you talk to Sid Drell?
He was ill. He was supposed to have been in Washington, but...
So anyway, you must talk to him.
Okay.
But he's very closely in touch with these people. And he's also a member of Jason. He's more in it than I am, and so he should be number one on that subject. And no, I think it's extremely hopeful. If only we had somebody who wasn't a jackass actually in the White House. But anyway, I think there's a chance. In this respect, in some ways, if this is really to work, we ought to have McCain as president and not Obama. You want to have somebody who is a hardliner by reputation to make this happen. And so the worse the better in a way. He shouldn't be some idiot like George Bush, but he should. But somebody like McCain, I think, could get this and run with it. And I think it could go. All it needs, in fact, is a president who's not afraid of making big decisions, and who also has some knowledge of what the big decisions actually are. I think McCain could do it. I don't see anybody else on the immediate horizon, but it has to be the president. It has to be, if it's to be done in a big style, not just more negotiations, but actually doing something. And but it's not accidental that Scowcroft is involved in this, of course, because he was Reagan in the Reagan team, and also in George Bush Sr.'s. He was there. I mean, he was, I think, a national security advisor to Bush Sr., I think. And so he was right there when they got rid of the tactical nukes, and so he knows how it's done. So anyway, I'm very hopeful about that. I mean, the bad news is that all these people are getting close to 90 years old.
Right.
So you have to do it fast.
Do it fast. Right. It's true. It's true. Well, I think it also, I don't know, if we can, what I'm hoping is we can broaden the base of public support for such a thing.
Yes.
If they can understand, if they can hear this on our website or, on...
Yes, that's the other way of doing it, of course. If you could have somebody like Obama to really persuade the public that this makes sense. But it's a lot harder doing it that way. And it means that sort of the whole country has to turn left. And if you could get right-wingers to do it, it's much easier.
It's true. That's true. It's great. Let's see, what other things have we not? Well, I like that the hedgehog and foxes. You want to talk about that? Why science? What kind of scientists there?
Yes, well, it's not only in science that that's true, but it was some Greek who invented the terminology, and then it became famous because of... anyway, it doesn't matter. But anyhow, the notion is that there are two kinds of people: the hedgehog who only knows one trick, and the fox who knows many tricks. And of course, the metaphor is the hedgehog, if anybody attacks him, he rolls himself up into a ball, and that's his trick. And the person who attacks then gets a bloody mouth, and that's all there is to it. Whereas the fox, of course, can be very clever and do all kinds of other things. And in science, that's also a good metaphor, that there are two kinds of scientists. There are the kind who just are obsessed with one big problem, spend the whole of their lives thinking about one problem, and maybe solve it or maybe don't, but that's their life work. Whereas there are the foxes who just jump around from one problem to another, exploring the world and all its different aspects, and so they have, in a way, the foxes have a lot more fun. They can sometimes discover very beautiful things, sometimes fall flat on their faces, but then they can go on to something else. So I'm a fox, and I find that for me, I can't sustain interest in one problem for more than about 6 months. And so I'm sort of an extreme case of a fox. But there are many very good scientists who are foxes. I can think of, Fermi was, of course, a conspicuous example, and that was most of the scientists since the 1930s have been foxes, and it's the 20s and 30s were the time when the hedgehogs had a field day. They sort of revolutionized the whole of physics and with quantum mechanics and making big discoveries every week, and so that was the era where foxes were where hedgehogs were running science in a beautiful way. And then when you came into the 40s and 50s, it turned out the foxes took over and began exploring the universe with a lot of new tools, and it was very exciting. And meanwhile, the old generation of hedgehogs were in bad trouble. They were all talking nonsense in different ways, and they produced very ambitious theories which didn't go anywhere, and so it was a bad time for hedgehogs. That's the time when I came into science. We just made fun of these old hedgehogs, the great heroes of quantum mechanics. Dirac and Heisenberg and Schrödinger were all talking nonsense in different ways, and they had these absurd theories that they were promoting. Meanwhile, we were getting along with exploring the universe, and so it was a dramatic switch from hedgehogs to foxes, which happened sort of more or less during World War II. And
so as a young scientist today, would you say that tactically today the foxes rule, or that this is a mode of operation that works well?
Well, it depends on which side you sit, of course, but I mean, at the moment, here at this institute, we have two groups of people who are both had the name of natural sciences, and which just hardly communicate with each other. And so on one side, there's a big group of string theorists who are all of them hedgehogs. They believe string theory is the answer, and it's a great, wonderful construction of wonderful mathematical ideas. I don't understand any of it. And they think that's going to be the key to the universe. They're on one side, so they're the hedgehogs. And then on the other side, there are the astronomers and the biologists whom I talk to. I can understand what they're doing. And they're all foxes. I mean, they're every day discovering new things and changing the problem from year to year. And so and the question is, of course, a big question, which is going to win, and we don't know. And the string theorists, of course, believe very, very, very strongly that they have the truth, and we believe on the hedgehog side that we're going ahead and solving the problems one at a time, and it's great fun. We're certainly, I mean, if you go to the lunches, you can see there's two different cultures. The hedgehog lunches are rather grim and silent affairs. Somebody stands in front of a blackboard and talks in a rather formal style, and hardly anybody else asks questions. Whereas in the Fox lunches, the astronomers' lunch, which happens every Tuesday, we went to one yesterday, there are lots of people talking about different things, and all of them talking, most of them at once, and they're much happier.
That's great. That's really great.
But I'm obviously biased.
Of course. But that's fun. That's good to hear. My son he went to Stanford because he did astrophysics as an undergraduate at Harvard, and got very into that. But he flirted with the idea that maybe there was something in theoretical physics that would be, really stimulating and interesting. But now I can tell him he's more of a fox than a hedgehog. He's in the right place.
Good. Well, I'm happy to hear that, yes.
I think so. I wondered if you could talking about different styles of management, how Oppenheimer ran the Los Alamos National Laboratory. I mean, picking up, and I guess you could credit, or people have credited, Ernest Lawrence's approach to his laboratory at Berkeley, before, it was working on the calutrons in the 30s, and how he had a remarkably open, collaborative approach, as opposed to the traditional, let's just take Cambridge Laboratory, where, Chadwick was working, pretty much by himself, and it sort of, that was the mode. One. You can correct me if I'm wrong. But
Yeah, well, I mean, Cambridge was actually a monarchy. Rutherford was actually totally in charge, and I mean, he told Chadwick what to do, but of course, then gave him huge freedom. I mean, but it was definitely a one-man show, and so it wasn't. But I think Lawrence was a bit like that too. I think he was pretty much of a monarch, but of course I wasn't there. But no, I wasn't there at Los Alamos either. But I have the impression that, Oppenheimer did an absolutely brilliant job at Los Alamos. And it was very different because it was so huge. It was 3,000 or 4,000 people, and he knew every person on every job. He had this amazing sort of ability to remember who was who and what they were doing, which is something wasn't a problem for Rutherford. He only had about 20 people there altogether. But anyway, that was the enormous strength of Oppenheimer. He was a conductor of this huge orchestra, and so he was the boss, but he gave them a huge freedom, of course, as well. And he had this remarkable rapport with General Groves. And that was what made the thing work so well, that he kept the confidence of Groves all the time, even when he did things that Groves disapproved of. And for example, having this completely open open sharing of information, which Groves thought was terribly dangerous. But Oppenheimer said, we have to have it or we won't get a bomb. And so he got it. So Oppenheimer prevailed in all these arguments with Groves. And that was an achievement. I think nobody else could have done that. Either they would have just taken such a strong dislike of Groves, they would have resigned, or else let Groves run the show, which would have been a disaster also. And so you needed somebody who had Groves' respect but could still enforce his will. And that's something which I think Oppenheimer was amazingly successful. And certainly everybody who was there always said, oh, he was a fine director, including Teller. Teller always said he got along very well with Oppenheimer at Los Alamos. He only quarreled with him later. And I think that was true. Teller was very hard to deal with. I've worked with Teller myself. And, he could be like a 5-year-old and throw tantrums. But if you could handle him, it was fine. And Oppenheimer certainly could handle him. So they got along very well during the war. And Teller only worked about, he said, 25% of the time on hydrogen bombs during the war. I think that's quite accurate. And the rest of the time he worked for Oppenheimer. And he said it was fine with him, and as long as he got his 25%. That's the same arrangement they have now at Google, that everybody gets 25% time to do what they like. And it's a wonderful way to run a lab. And I think the closest we have to Oppenheimer now is Larry and Sergey at Google, and they have that style. And I visited Google last year, and it immediately made me think of Los Alamos. Those people really are having fun.
That's great.
And they're changing the world as well.
We'll leave that in, and maybe they'll help sponsor this
Yes.
project.
I always think private money is much better than public money if you really want to get funds. And it's so much more flexible, and you don't have to spend your time writing grants. No, I would recommend Google very strongly. They're helping us to build a sky survey now.
Oh.
There's a new sky survey which is going to be a really fine sky survey, and Google is funding it.
Okay, if you could talk about the role that Oak Ridge played and how the Manhattan Project was really 3 major sites and actually probably dozens of other sites that were not owned and run by the government, but contributed.
Yes, I got to know Oak Ridge, of course, much later, but it's done a lot of wonderful things. It was the principal place for peaceful nuclear energy for 20 or 30 years after the war, and of course very soon Alvin Weinberg became the director, and he stayed there for the rest of his life. He's just died this year, but last year. Alvin Weinberg was a great character, and I liked him enormously. It was not at all the Oppenheimer style. He was much just a quiet but very effective director, and he spent his whole life essentially on one problem. He was a hedgehog, and anyhow, so he developed nuclear reactors of all kinds. It was creative engineering. It wasn't science, but it was very creative engineering, building weird reactors, and it was a great time to be in that business. And so it was nuclear energy as an art form, and so they actually made a lot of very important inventions, only one of which has ever been used for commercial power, which was the light water reactor, which was essentially a collaboration with the Navy. It was essentially the submarine reactor that dominated the commercial world ever since. And anyway, unfortunately, everything else was switched off. I mean, they stopped doing this sort of creative engineering at the time when the light water reactors were chosen as the reactors for commercial nuclear power. And I think that was a very big mistake. The fact is, I mean, if you look at the airplane as it now exists, it actually works so well because there were 100,000 different designs which were actually tried out. And well, in nuclear power, of course, that's not happened. And we never found the good ones because we never looked. And so they just made this arbitrary choice of the light water reactor of the conventional kind, which we all dislike today because it is unsafe and it has all kinds of bad characteristics. And but it was chosen essentially because it fitted into a submarine, and it was so they had a crash program to build nuclear submarines. So the industry got started with nuclear reactors for submarines, and that's what they've been doing ever since. They're not called submarine reactors, but that's where they are. Of course, the main thing you have to have if you want a reactor to fit into a submarine is it has to be very compact. It has to have a high density of power, which is just what makes it dangerous, of course. Whereas for a civilian reactor, you want the opposite. You want it to have a low density, lots of thermal capacity, so it can absorb huge amounts of heat, so it won't melt down. And so that what you want is really the opposite of what the Navy wanted. But that's never happened because Oak Ridge essentially was told, don't do that, which is very unfortunate. So Oak Ridge then stopped building reactors and then turned its attention to other things. And when I became involved, they were in fact sort of the leading place in the country for studying energy, largely because of Alvin Weinberg. I mean, Alvin Weinberg always believed that, first of all, that nuclear power was important, and secondly, that carbon dioxide was important, that there would be a big problem with carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And he saw those two things, of course, as strongly coupled together. And so he actually organized a thing called the Institute of Energy Analysis, which I became a regular visitor. That's where I learned about climate and all these things which are now fashionable. He was doing that 30 years ago, and one of the things he did was to bring in a lot of biologists. And he understood from the beginning that carbon dioxide problem was half biology and half physics. The biological half is just as important as the meteorological half, and that the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is very strongly coupled with carbon dioxide in the ocean and carbon dioxide in trees and carbon dioxide in soil. They're all about equal in quantity, strongly coupled together. So you can't deal with the atmosphere without dealing with all the others. And he understood that the soil was probably the best way of grappling with the problem. Soil is something that we can measure and understand. It's easier than meteorology. It stays, more or less stays put. So we could deal with the climate problem essentially with biology rather than with passing rules about burning fossil fuels. And anyway, that's what I learned from him at Oak Ridge, which has been sort of a big part of my life ever since. And so Oak Ridge had a lot of interesting people, and I remember I met the sister of Claire Nader was there. I mean, sister of Ralph Nader, whose name was Claire Nader. She was at Oak Ridge, and she's a very interesting person. She's a biologist who is very much interested in the environment and has some of her brother's force of personality. She was a close friend of Alvin Weinberg. And so it was a place where radicals were welcome.
Well, that's fascinating.
And then he was also a leader in putting up this friendship bell at Oak Ridge, which was the last time I saw him, actually. It was, I don't know, maybe 6 or 7 years ago. And this beautiful bronze bell was actually manufactured in Japan and then shipped over to Oak Ridge and set up as a monument to I think it's officially a monument to Pearl Harbor and nuclear bombs. I mean, as being sort of two evil aspects of technology. But it's supposed to be sort of equal share of blame between Japan and the United States. And when we dedicated it, we each had a partner from Japan. So there was a schoolgirl from America and a schoolgirl from Japan, and there was a professor from America and a professor from Japan. And I forget who my opposite number was. Anyway, we rang. It takes two people to actually ring the bell, and so we each, two of us rang in turn, and then they had a lot of poetry being recited in English and Japanese. It was a very moving occasion. So that was Alvin Weinberg, and I think it's the spirit of Weinberg is always very strong at Oak Ridge. So I hope that stays alive.
That's great. Yeah, I hope so too. I actually met him, and we had on tape, he talked about the X10 graphite reactor and how he developed that. That was at least 10 years ago,
Oh,
10
yes.
or 12 years ago.
Yes, well, that's of course a historic monument, but we've not built any more like that. And
Right, that's air-cooled.
yes,
Yeah. But it
worked.
It worked, right. Right. We're what other things have I not asked you about that I really should have that you'd like to say?
Well, let's look at the agenda. But
Should I stop?
Okay, sure. Just want to pause it. Yeah.
I'm rolling.
Yeah, right. Okay.
you're rolling.
He's ready to.
Yeah, well, people, of course, make a lot of fuss and a lot of noise about attracting young people into science. And it's supposed to be terrible because if you look at American graduate schools, that almost half of them or more than half are Asians. the really bright graduate students. And we're not producing our own scientists, but we're importing them from India and China and various other places. Well, I don't think that's bad at all. I think it should be a global enterprise. Science always has been a global enterprise, and it works best when it's more international rather than less. And so by all means, let's get the best, but we don't have to produce them here. And trying to force our young people into science just because we think that it's somehow good for the country, I think is probably harmful and counterproductive. And I think I think of the analogy with England and Japan when we were emerging from World War II. I mean, both England and Japan were in bad shape after World War II. And the English government was persuaded that we had to have more science in order to recover from the war and so on. And in fact, England led the world in a fraction of the national income that was put into pure science. They did extremely well, and I mean, we had wonderful scientists and lots of Nobel Prizes, and of course discovered the double helix and all kinds of great things. Started radio astronomy and many new things. And Japan, on the other hand, decided we want to rebuild the country, and we don't need science. All we need is to copy what the other people do and then improve on it ourselves. And so the Japanese chose just to support basic industries and particularly information science, but really not science, but technology. And of course you could see the results. In 20 years Japan was rich and England was comparatively poor. And there's no doubt that if you want to get rich, then doing a lot of science is not the way. But it shouldn't be sold to the public on that basis. And I mean, England, of course, did all right, I mean, in the end, but not as well as we should have. I mean, while all this beautiful science was being done in England, the British automobile industry collapsed as the Japanese automobile industry flourished. And we see the results today. I mean, nobody drives English cars and they all drive Japanese. Still, England had the best science. And I think people should be aware of that. I mean, what do you want? And if you want it, you can have it. And this country should be certainly doing as much science as people want to do, and there's plenty to be done. But it's not going to be particularly beneficial to the automobile industry. The automobile industry needs something else.
That's true.
So I'd say my advice to young people is that do what you can do. I mean, it is everybody should have the maximum freedom of choice. If you want to be a medieval scholar, be a medieval scholar, and don't think that's not fulfilling your destiny. And maybe it is, or maybe it isn't. But anyway, we have a certain number of people who are amazingly gifted in science, and they should be given support and encouragement. But don't think it has to be 5% of the university population or whatever it is. That's irrelevant. I mean, the important thing, people should have opportunities. They shouldn't be pushed into things they're not suited for. And I have a sort of an elitist view of science. I think science is tremendous fun, but it's only a few people who really have the gift for it. And just the same is true of music or almost any other trade or acting. I mean,